What is the most corrupt thing you've witnessed your employer do? After college, I worked selling Yellow Pages advertising. A big part of the job was renewing old ads in the book, which meant calling each business to get them to renew. However, as the Yellow Pages became less and less relevant, more customers canceled their ads. In response, the company changed its policy, automatically renewing customers who didn't actively cancel. They'd send out renewal notices late on purpose, making it hard for customers to cancel in time to avoid the next year's charges. If we received a cancellation call and actually canceled the ad, we'd get in trouble. At another company, the customer service reps were rewarded for preventing returns. They tried to convince customers to keep products they wanted to return, aiming to extend the refund window. I worked with a law firm that had issues with Yellow Pages advertising. They didn't realize they were being overcharged for years because they were so profitable that they didn't manage their expenses well. When a colleague and I, who had experience with better run firms, looked into it, we found a lot of problems. An employee had stolen a large amount of money, and the firm was still paying benefits for people who hadn't worked there in years. The Yellow Pages situation was bad, but the firm's lack of ethics was also a big issue. At the Yellow Pages company, we weren't allowed to cancel ads easily. We'd keep customers on the phone, confusing them until they gave up and called back another day. We even made games out of it. Now, it's important to note that these practices weren't illegal. Customers were given annual notice by USPS because the ads were printed once a year. If you didn't cancel and your ad was printed, you couldn't just take it back since it was in thousands of books. Also, not everyone has internet access outside of cities, and the print books still do well. Most customers who tried to sue would lose because there was proof they got value from their ads. That's why these companies are still in business. Though I'm glad I don't work there anymore, many business owners aren't very smart, in my experience. Interestingly, most of the phone numbers in the Yellow Pages were provided by phone companies that also had their own Yellow Pages. By law, they had to share the numbers, but there was a loophole. They didn't have to be up to date. So, some businesses paid a lot for fancy ads next to outdated directory listings with phone numbers from a decade ago. Well, at least it was great that he was able to identify and address some of the problems, even if it was a bit of a wild goose chase. I guess it's not easy to navigate through murky waters of corporate mismanagement and unethical practices, especially in an analog age. Story 2. I've encountered employers who tried to pressure employees into working off the clock without directly asking to avoid legal trouble. They managed to convince some people to do it, but if anyone complained afterward, they were just let go. By reducing their hours until they were forced to quit, the employer ensured they couldn't file for unemployment. I made it clear from the start that I wouldn't participate in such schemes. The first time they attempted this with me, I asked if they were suggesting working off the clock. They quickly backpedaled, claiming they were just looking for volunteers. I responded by saying I couldn't volunteer and asked if they wanted me to stay clocked in or go home since my shift was over. They decided to let me go home, and from then on, they didn't like me much. They reduced my hours, but not completely. Fortunately, I had already reached out to a previous employer who was happy to have me back. I had taken the new job because it paid about $3 more per hour, but it wasn't worth it if it meant working for free. In another situation, while in college, I worked at a high-volume upscale jewelry store and preferred working in the warehouse. However, the store wanted me to switch to sales, thinking that as a young, fit female, I could persuade men to buy more expensive jewelry for women. They initially tried to get me to switch by falsely accusing me of a mistake, switching a packing label, which resulted in a baby shower gift being sent to a new bride who was not pregnant. They offered to forgive me if I moved to sales. When I still resisted, they reduced my hours. Despite this, the store is still in operation, though it's no longer considered upscale. It seems their business practices eventually caught up with them. In another instance, my hours were reduced down to about 8 hours a week, and the schedule indicated this would be the new norm. I confronted my manager, threatening to file for partial unemployment. He claimed there was no such thing, but I told him he could either look it up or find out when my paperwork arrived from the County Office of Human Resources. The next day, I received an email about a schedule change and all my hours had been increased. I also experienced a situation where I worked for a bookstore during a slow period around 2008-2010. Jobs were scarce, so I stayed at minimum wage with 8 to 14 hours a week, despite the risk of not making ends meet. I filed for partial unemployment, and after 2 payments, my company suddenly found the means to give me 32 to 40-hour weeks. It was astonishing how they could afford to employ me full time after that. However, they would only do this for 2 weeks at a time, as offering benefits was required after so many weeks of full time work. Every third week, my hours would drop below 20. We managed to get through the tough times by refiling for unemployment whenever I went more than 2 weeks without full hours. Unfortunately, the company filed for bankruptcy about 10 years ago and closed down. I love that job, but the company was struggling. Story 3. I worked at a small brewery and caught the owner taking money from the tip jar at the end of busy nights. It was a new establishment that was struggling during the off season. We had a small staff consisting of 2 bartenders and the owners, a husband and wife team. The bar staff would pool and split the day's tips. Discovered that the owner was taking a portion of the tips, claiming that he worked there too. When I confronted him, I explained that this was against the Fair Labor Standards Act, the FLSA. It's actually listed as an illegal practice regarding tips. He insisted it was his right as the owner and fired me, so I reported him to the Department of Labor. In another situation, my girlfriend worked at a deli where the owner took half of the tip. She had no experience in the food industry and wasn't sure if this was normal. She asked me, knowing I had been a chef, and I explained that an owner taking tips is highly frowned upon in the food service industry. My sister had a similar experience working at a hot dog restaurant in high school. The manager kept all the tips and even made another employee pay for a donut making machine he broke due to lack of proper training. This place sold hot dogs for $7 and profited from the hard work of young people. If you're ever in Toronto, avoid the fancy hot dog restaurant with a dog logo. As a barista, I encountered a bar manager who stayed in his office all morning only to come out at the end of the shift, make a few drinks, and chat with regulars for 15 minutes. Then he would take an equal share of the morning tips. Baristas started splitting tips hourly to prevent him from taking a full share. I wasn't aware of this rule, but I'll keep the FLSA in mind for any future workplace issues regarding pay. 6 years ago, I worked at a pub in the UK where tipping the bartender wasn't common. For a change in management, the landlord would empty the drip trays into pint glasses and instruct us to top up pints with them to save stock. I never used them, but it made me feel sick knowing some customers might receive dirty pints. I couldn't do anything about it without risking my job, and I wasn't in a position to lose it at the time either. So when the brewery owner's tiptoeing into the tip jar, it's time to tap into the Department of Labor, am I right? Story 4. During my time as a housekeeper at a hotel, our head housekeeper would enter all of our completed rooms and take the tips before we could collect them. I recall seeing tips in my rooms and naively not picking them up before they vanished. Several of my coworkers also witnessed similar incidents. On one occasion, a guest told me she would leave a generous tip in her room because it was in disarray. I later learned that the head housekeeper had cleaned the room herself. She eventually left about a year later after our general manager demoted her to a regular housekeeper due to numerous complaints from the staff. She was generally a very unpleasant person. In another situation, as a housekeeper, you would receive your list of rooms at the start of a shift. If we couldn't finish all the rooms that day, some housekeepers would go into their assigned rooms and collect the tips, ensuring that if they were off the next day or the room was reassigned, they would still receive the tips. However, the head housekeeper was on a salary and wasn't permitted to keep tips even if they were given directly to her. Story 5. During my time as a chef in college, I worked for 14 consecutive days, with half of those days being 12-hour shifts. This all occurred within one pay period. It was challenging, but I was excited about the substantial amount of overtime I was expecting. My calculations, including taxes, indicated I would receive almost an additional $1,000 on my paycheck. When I picked up my paycheck, it was larger than usual since I typically worked only 25 hours a week, but there was no overtime payment. It was nearly $1,000 short of what I had anticipated. The next day, I visited the HR office located at a different casino to inquire about this discrepancy. They told me that in Nevada, overtime is only paid if you normally work an average of 40 hours a week. This didn't seem right to me, so I asked my mom, who used to handle finances for our family business. She confirmed that this was incorrect and showed me the statute online. It clearly stated that if you work more than 8 hours in a day, you are entitled to overtime pay with no mention of a weekly average. With this information in hand, I returned to the HR office and presented the statute to them. The woman who had given me the false information called the head of HR. Despite their friendly demeanor, they always seemed a bit shady. Both appeared nervous and, in a stuttering voice, agreed to reevaluate the situation. I never received an apology or any further communication, but my next paycheck included the exact amount of overtime I had calculated, down to the penny. When I shared this story with some of the other kitchen staff, I learned that the family who owned the casino where our restaurant was located was known for such practices. They would make accounting errors, taking advantage of the fact that many employees with direct deposit don't scrutinize their pay stubs. It's ironic how these errors always seem to benefit the company, never resulting in extra money for the employees. A server experienced the same issue just a few months later, highlighting the unscrupulous nature of the management. Wow, that's a really tough grind right there. 14 days straight with half of them being 12-hour shifts. Now, that's dedication. And to think they try to shortchange them on their overtime pay, that's just blatantly ugh. But hey, if you're enjoying the video and you can relate to any one of these stories, please don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Story 6. I used to work for a company that was owned by an organization with political ties. There was a wealthy Middle Eastern investor who owed my employer a significant amount of money, millions, from a contract that were never paid. It was a delicate matter that everyone wanted to keep out of court. After some negotiations, the investor agreed to pay the debt in exchange for a seat on the board of directors. Everything was settled, and the investor was set to pay with a grand event planned to announce his new position on the board. However, just weeks before the event, the head of my organization became ill and required surgery, leading to an extended absence. The grand event had to be postponed. It turned out that our boss wasn't really sick and didn't really need surgery. In fact, the head of the organization that owned my employer was running for political office and was concerned about the public perception of the situation, allowing a wealthy Middle Eastern investor to gain influence over the organization in exchange for payment. The boss was instructed to pretend to be ill for an extended period, delaying the event until after the election. In another situation, I resigned from a job when I discovered that my employer had misrepresented the company's status and my role within it. Now, there's a difference between presenting information in the best light and outright lying. 4 years later, after that company failed, the former employer attempted to start a new venture. He reached out to members of the development team to build his e-commerce website, but he never paid any of them. Story 7. I worked for a company that managed parking meters. Our job was to issue tickets to drivers who didn't pay or overstayed their time at the meters. I was part of the customer service team, which meant I answered calls and responded to letters from people who wanted to challenge their tickets. The issue was that we couldn't assist callers directly. We were instructed to tell them they needed to write a letter, and only then could we review their dispute. The second issue was that we never had the authority to approve any disputes. Every single one was denied regardless of the circumstances. We would receive calls from elderly individuals who had gone to the hospital for a procedure that ran a few minutes longer than expected, resulting in a ticket. They would be on the phone, distressed and unable to afford the ticket, asking for understanding. I empathized, but I wasn't permitted to show it. When they asked to speak to a manager, my manager flatly refused to take any calls. We were not allowed to transfer calls to her. The unethical aspect was that at the time it was illegal for privately owned companies like ours to issue parking meter tickets. Despite this, the management team continued to fight legal battles, but the practice remained illegal. Consequently, we had to inform every caller that they had to pay their ticket, write a letter that would ultimately be rejected, or face a fine that was technically illegal, all while we couldn't disclose any of this information. The company continues to operate despite the illegality of its practices. I recently came across a news article from 2016 that shed light on their ongoing operations. According to the article, a reporter attempted to dispute a ticket but was threatened with legal action if they didn't pay. When the news outlet tried to reach the company for comment, they were met with silence. The article also revealed that the company generates over $600 million annually from parking fees alone. In another story, I worked in campus parking enforcement where ticket payment was strictly enforced for students and employees. The tickets were linked to their student or employee accounts, and the school could withhold transcripts, block class registration, or even ban individuals from testing center if the tickets weren't paid. However, for non-students and non-faculty, the tickets were not enforceable for payment. If someone parked in a handicap spot, a fire lane, or a no parking zone, their vehicle could be towed, but any ticket issued was not financially binding. During events that would attract visitors from across the country, we would issue numerous tickets, often more than 60 per shift. When people inquired about their tickets, I would ask if they were students or employees. If they weren't, I would inform them that they were not legally obligated to pay the fine. While the campus could send unpaid tickets to collections, they didn't have the legal right to do so. However, many people are unaware of this or choose not to contest it. Story 8. I worked at a restaurant where all credit card tips were added to our paychecks instead of being cashed out at the end of the night. Every pay period, I kept a copy of every shift report and checked my pay stub against it. My coworkers thought it was odd, especially because the math was complex, involving taxes and tip outs. I trusted the owners, but I didn't like not walking out with my money, knowing that some people in the industry can be dishonest. After months of finding no errors and getting good at the math, I received a paycheck that seemed short. I knew something was wrong and did my calculations, discovering that my check was missing about $115. I informed my manager and we went through the math together. He agreed with me, and my coworkers were amazed, starting to keep their own records after that. The restaurant issued me a check for the difference. I never found out exactly what happened, but I suspect it had to do with the accountant. She didn't believe my check was short, but my manager, who was relatively new and someone I hadn't liked much before this, stood up for me and earned my respect. In another job, I had a similar experience. I always kept my printouts and took pictures of my time card, keeping meticulous records. They changed accountants, and she claimed to be new and learning. As a CPA, handling tips and taxes shouldn't have been difficult. Every week, we reported our tips and hoped our checks would be correct, but they never were. I was overpaid and underpaid with incorrect hours and wages. Eventually, we had a heated discussion with my boss, who said, "She's new, she's figuring it out." She wasn't. The missing amounts were added to the next paycheck, which was frustrating, especially when I was short $300 for rent. They also weren't paying taxes correctly, which should have been a red flag. I left the job soon after. So, when your restaurant's tip policy is added to your paycheck, but you turn into Sherlock Holmes to make every penny is accounted for, that's next level stuff, and good stuff too. Story 9. My first job after college was at a family owned company where the owner's son oversaw manufacturing. One day, a warehouse employee came to my desk for paperwork and mentioned that he worked a lot of overtime. However, once he reached 40 hours, he had to clock out and then clock back in under a staffing agency owned by the owner's son, which was technically considered a second job. Now, this seemed suspicious, so I looked it up and confirmed that it was illegal and a common scam. I went about my day without giving it much more thought, which was a mistake. The warehouse employee apparently mentioned to the boss that I had told him the overtime arrangement was illegal. The next day, the owner's son came in, yelled at me, and fired me in front of the entire office. If you're thinking I should have sought legal help, I did try. I consulted with 2 different employment attorneys, but both said there was no case since I had no written evidence, and it was my word against theirs. I applied for unemployment, but my claim was appealed 5 times. In Texas, the final unemployment appeal is decided by a tribunal consisting of 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat. The Republicans ruled in favor of the employer without even reviewing the details of the case, so I had to pay the state $6,000 that I had received while out of work. That was about 8 years ago, and my career has since improved, but it was a very difficult time I experienced back in 2013. Story 10. I used to work at Blockbuster, where we were required to sell a certain number of Blockbuster Rewards memberships, both individually and as a store. Customers had the option to carry a balance on their account, such as leaving a late fee to be paid on their next visit. Our store manager was enrolling customers in rewards memberships without their consent and adding the membership fee to their account balance. We became aware of this when we would tell customers about their balance and they would not know about it. When I mentioned that it seemed they had signed up for rewards on their previous visit, they would inform me that they had not agreed to any such thing. Checking the transaction records, we could see that our store manager was responsible for these unauthorized enrollments. After several months, we started receiving calls from customers who were confused about receiving collection notices for $9.95. Reviewing the transaction history, we found that our store manager was behind every single instance. Despite this, we were still being criticized for not meeting our sales targets. A co-worker and I tried to report this to the district manager. He came to the store, told us that what the store manager was doing wasn't illegal, and then left. I resigned shortly after that. In another job, I worked for Starbucks, and it was great at first. When I started, I worked 3 hours away from headquarters, and the management was pretty awesome. There were no issues. However, after transferring to the South, it became a chaotic experience from the beginning. It seemed like no one got fired unless they stole from the company or the district manager didn't like them, often because they complained about working conditions or were treated poorly. The final straw for me wasn't the stress related issues or the harsh words from managers and the district manager. It was when my entire in laws' family homes were at risk due to a massive forest fire. I called in sick a day earlier than my planned vacation because I was experiencing a difficult emotional time. My manager called me at 7 a.m. to scold me on the phone, which upset me to the point of tears because she might lose her job due to her poor planning, and she blamed me for it. This was the same manager who had given another employee 3 days off because her newly rescued cat had died. Needless to say, I was relieved that my 2 weeks' notice was already in and I never returned to finish them. Alright, if you liked any of these stories and related to at least one of them, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're gonna love this. I'll catch you in that video.